serious budget cuts, and so this is actually a way to help the school district. It's also nice to have external funding. Of course, it's hard to get, right? But it's nice to have it for the sake of being able to say this is not funded by the district, and for the wider community, sometimes that's an important detail, because I don't want people to think that we're just saying whatever the district wants us to say and that they're paying us to do it, but rather that our funding comes from elsewhere. And yeah, that's a good question. So we did get initial funding from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to start this partnership, and then we later, and we've gotten subsequent grants from them, and then we also got funding from the Houston Endowment, which is another local foundation. And as of last week, we're getting funding from the Kinder Foundation as well to expand this partnership, which I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But I wanted to give you one quick example of a study that was actually just completed, or the research brief was released last week, where we were asked to do an evaluation of HISD values in Houston Independent School District. It's the largest school district in Texas and about the 7th largest in the country. So it's got over 215,000 students. About 80% of them are economically disadvantaged, and it's about 8% white. Right? So that gives you an idea of this particular school district that we're working with. So we've been meeting, by the way, I meet with them at least every other week with the school district leaders to talk about the research agenda, to talk about the research studies in progress, and so they know what's coming. Nothing is a surprise. We always inform them first before anything is released publicly. And one of the studies that they had asked us to do was an evaluation of their pre-K programs, and we found that this is after controlling for a whole host of factors that you might expect to be important for predicting school readiness in kindergarten. Right? So we found that basically students that took 1 year of HISD pre-K were basically 2.8 times more likely to be school ready than students that took 0 years of HISD pre-K. So we're like, wow, this is after controlling for all these other factors, and really this is a pretty big impact. And by the way, this is probably an underestimate, because the people in the 0 category could have taken pre-K somewhere else, or they could have done something else, because we can't just, unfortunately, because of data limitations, we can't disentangle whether it's really 0, like they did nothing, or did they do something but just somewhere else. We're working on with the district to collect better data on that to be able to disentangle that in the future. But even then, we found that it made a big difference. And by the way, we found this both for English test scores and Spanish test scores. And because of the partnership, as soon as we released these findings, the superintendent responded almost immediately. First of all, because he was expecting it, he knew it was coming, they had asked for it. He said this is going to the governor, because they're in the process right now of trying to make the case for state-funded pre-K in Texas. It's apparently a big thing. When we see results like this, we're like, why are people arguing about this? Like whether or not this is a worthwhile investment. I mean, wow. But hey, whatever we can do to provide information that can help them make that case. This is the part that's so exciting to me, because I'm like, like I just said at the very beginning, I wasn't able to point to anything that I had done that had actually led to any kind of a change, right? And now, just like with almost every brief, we can see like how the district is using it, whether it's good news or bad news. By the way, this one happened to be quote unquote good news in the sense that hey, pre-K is making a big difference in terms of school readiness. But we've done evaluations on, for example, some years ago on a program for struggling readers. The school district has a lot of kids that are reading below grade level, as I'm sure many school districts have that challenge. And the school district invested millions of dollars on a program for struggling readers. And we did an evaluation of it, we did a regression discontinuity design, using the test score cutoffs and comparing students that were just above the test score cutoff that qualified for this program versus those that were just below the cutoff that didn't qualify for the program, didn't get it, and we didn't find any statistically significant differences. Like, oh, and then we did, because we're in partnership with the school district, they actually changed the test score cutoff so that we can test a different part of the distribution to see, well, maybe if it doesn't help the students here, maybe it'll help the students in this part of the distribution. We still didn't find a statistically significant difference. And, so that was discouraging news for the district, but guess what? I mean, they were like, okay, so if this isn't working, we shouldn't spend our money here. But the problem is still there, right? So they're trying other things now, but at least now they know, okay, that isn't working, we need to try something else. And so even when it's disappointing news, that's the really exciting part about doing the research in this manner, that I can feel like, hey, we're working with the people that are making decisions about these programs or these investments.
In a case like that, since you now have a relationship with this school district, are you able to leverage that to bring in maybe other research-based practices that have worked for this particular issue and get them to trust your judgment that maybe that's what they should try instead?
That's a great question. So so part of what we're doing, most of what we're doing is actually doing original studies for that particular district. But part of what we're doing is also helping them or just giving them a second opinion about other research studies out there. Because the fact is, I mean, it's hard even for us as trained researchers, it's hard to, well, sometimes it's not hard to distinguish between sloppy research and not so sloppy research, right? But sometimes it is a little bit harder. You have to really read it carefully to say, okay, is this a rigorous study? Is this well done? Can you imagine it's even more challenging for someone who does not necessarily have a research background? They're trained as administrators, not necessarily as researchers. And they want to know, like, well, sometimes they'll say, oh, we've heard of studies about this, and we just, or they'll say, we were familiar with, like, the What Works clearinghouse or anything, but they're like, there are all sorts of questions about it. It's very limited information in terms of the whys and the hows and those other kinds of questions that they really want to know. So it's really helpful sometimes to be able to have, your local researcher on speed dial is, can you give me a second opinion on this? So they have asked us on a few occasions to do that, give them second opinions on someone else's research. Yes?
So given kind of the tangled nature of the research that gets done in this context, it's a sort of a two-part question. There's when you speak, there's an issue of how do you deal with the responsibility of being that involved in the decision-making process, and I'll use an example to sort of illustrate this point. So, the fact that an effect isn't found doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It might just not rise to the level of being detected given your strategy of trying to find it. So for an example, our speaker last week said that $500 was actually given to high school students if you use traditional techniques like HLM and a few other quantitative techniques, no difference. But if he actually developed a really fancy new method that I'm not going to try to explain, but he actually found that if we looked at something different, then there was an effect there. But so for me, there's a it's just a tension. So I'm curious as to how you navigate it, because it's not with a lot of our research we can't come down definitively a lot of the time. X doesn't work, Y does work. So how do you navigate that?
That's a great question. So one of the tensions that we face as researchers working closely with the school district is that, well, at least I used to think that, once you put research on the table, that people will pay attention to it and use it and make decisions based on that research. Turns out that's not the way decisions are made. Now, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that's pretty naive, right? But this is really what I thought, right? Turns out that, actually, a lot of the times, unfortunately, decisions are made with no research at the table. That's the reality. But even when there is research at the table, what happens is that's one of many other factors that have to be taken into consideration. And so the final decision may actually run counter to whatever the research recommends, because of so many other realities. And the reason why I'm mentioning this in light of your question is because of the fact that you might find a small effect or a large effect, or you might find that there is no effect, but maybe in reality there is an effect that you just didn't detect. But from a decision maker perspective, like what they want to know is this worth it? Because there's always something that you have to, what?
Cost benefit.
Yeah, there's a cost benefit, but it's not just what we would think of the cost benefit analysis for research purposes, but like other things that are outside of the scope of what we can do through a research study, right? So like if you find that there could be an effect, but it's a small effect, or you just weren't able to detect it because it was so small, like from their perspective that might be irrelevant. Like they might be like, this is only worthwhile if it's an effect that's large enough, right? To make it worth taking money from somebody else, for example. Those kinds of decisions. So I would say, yeah, I think doing cost-benefit analysis is extremely important. That can help, but then there's a whole other layer beyond the scope of what, and that's something that I've had to come to terms with as a researcher to understand. It's not just about research, even though as researchers, we want to prioritize research as like that's it, that's the end-all be-all. But that's not the way it works. I'll give you one quick example that has, because equity is really our ultimate goal. We're in this partnership because we're trying to help the district in terms of closing gaps and in terms of being more equitable across the district. And one of the things one of the challenges that we found was that in the school funding, right, they have different weights for different kinds of students. And we found that the students that are gifted and talented, their weight is almost twice as much as the weight for economically disadvantaged students. Now think about that. Do you really think it costs twice as much to educate a GT student versus an economically disadvantaged student? I suspect it's probably the other way around, frankly. And then the other problem is, of course, white students are overrepresented among the GT students, and minority students are overrepresented among the economically disadvantaged students, so it's also a racial issue. And it's an inequity, a huge inequity. And so from a research perspective, right, you could just say, hey, just do the math, right? This is inequitable, fix it. But then from a reality perspective, in terms of all the other political issues that the school district leaders are having to face, turns out if you mess with the funding for GT students, you're going to piss off some very powerful parents in the school district who are white, right, primarily, and who have a very strong voice. And they're already dealing with white flight. I just said it's only 8% white. And you want to do this, then you put it at risk, like producing more white flight, and from families that, so they're like, oh, we have to deal with these larger political realities that are, in some ways beyond the scope of what we can do as researchers, right? And like, because my suggestion was like change the formula. That's inequitable. And then they were like, you've got to understand the way these things work. There are side effects to everything you do. And sometimes the side effect can be just as detrimental. I still think that they should change the formula, frankly. But just saying that's the response that I got. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with the response that I got. Actually, so they did the school district actually redirected several $1 million for to focus on what we would call hyper-poverty schools to try to address this issue, but they didn't change the underlying formula. So I was like, well, that's good, but it's a Band-Aid solution, right? It's tough. I mean, it's just like every time the more I get into this, I'm like, this is more complicated than I thought as a researcher. But I also, so that's at the local level, like this is really what we're working on right now in Houston. But of course, in the process of doing this, like coming up with all of these challenges and trying to figure out like how to deal with district turnover, right? I worked so hard to build relationships with school district people, and I invest a lot of time in this. And some people have questioned that, like, you're a researcher and you're spending how much time talking to the school district? I'm like, well, that's my goal. That's my goal. If I can if I'm not if my research isn't being used, then I don't know why I'm producing research in the first place. For me. By the way, there's some researchers that would really disagree with me, and I do get pushback about this sometimes. Like, what about basic research? What about this isn't for everyone? That kind of a thing. It's fine, but I do think that more academic researchers should do research in this way. I don't think we have enough of them right now. So I do want to encourage you all, especially those of you in education. I think there's a desperate need for this, and people want this. That's the other thing you should know. People want, if it's done right. If it's done right, right? If you're actually approaching people saying, I want to hear your expertise, and I want to share my expertise, and it's really a two-way street, as opposed to I'm the expert and I know everything about this subject, and that's a different. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but really, but a lot of times academics do have that kind of an attitude, and it turns people off, and they say, oh, you're just using us for your publications, right? You don't really care about the schools, or you don't really care about the students. And I have heard this, by the way, people are concerned about that from academic research. But anyway, so I'm trying to figure out how to deal with all of these different challenges. I kept calling on people in other partnerships, in the Chicago Consortium, and at the Stanford San Francisco Unified Partnership, and all these different places. And we last year I helped to launch a national network of these education and research practice partnerships. And we have, I don't know, about 17 or 18 member partnerships right now from all over the country. And we get together on an annual basis. And what's really fun and exciting about that is that every partnership sends at least 2 representatives, one from the research institution side and one from the education agency side. And it's really fantastic because, as you all know, I mean, there are plenty of opportunities for academic researchers to get together. There are opportunities for school district leaders to get together, though not as many. But there are very few opportunities for both of them to get together in this way. So those meetings, every time we get together, I'm like, wow, I learned so much from them. So we developed this network to try to support both existing and developing research practice partnerships. There are like the Chicago Consortium is probably the oldest one. They've been around since the early 90s. And in fact, HERC was modeled after the Chicago Consortium. I literally called up someone at the Chicago Consortium, and they sent to me their MOU, their Memorandum of Understanding, and I just customized it for Houston, and that was our very first MOU. It was literally using the Chicago Consortium as a template. So we share information about how to start these partnerships, about how to maintain them, what kinds of questions we should be asking. There's a lot of information that we put on this website that builds off of some work that was done by the William T. Grant Foundation, and they had all this on their website, and now it's on the NERC website, and then we've been building on it and maintaining it. We also try to synthesize research findings. These are research findings that are based on the partnership research model that I mentioned earlier. This is a different kind of research, and we really try to synthesize these findings and learn from one another, because a lot of us are working on very similar topics. And we're also using this national network to try to facilitate comparative work across different cities. But again, it's comparative work done in this partnership model. We think that's extremely important. And more recently, we've also been trying to advance policy and reform at the federal level. Just a few weeks ago, I spent a couple of days on Capitol Hill, one full day in the House and one full day in the Senate, meeting with just about every committee that has anything to do with education and research. The situation is very bleak, I'm sorry to report, in the new administration. I learned a new term. It's non-defense discretionary funding. Apparently that's where education falls. I was like, oh, we're non-defense discretionary spending, is what I should say. Like, yeah, that's where education falls. So, people were very nice to me and very receptive, about, oh yeah, we agree with you, education and research is very important, we just don't have any funding for it. So like NIH is going to get slashed, IES is going to get slashed, NSF slashed. I mean, expect those cuts to be severe. Because, you know, sorry, now I'm getting all political, because we need to build a wall and we need to do other things that are apparently more important than, I was like, you want to fight terrorism? Invest in education. Like, that's how you fight terrorism, don't you think? I don't know, sorry, I'm getting really political. Okay, so let me go back to this. But we are interested in, you know, we want to pay attention to what's going on at the federal level as well, because we're all, as education researchers, we're all impacted by what's going on at the federal government. Now I want to talk a little bit about the regional level. So this is a very new thing for me because up to this point I've only been partnering with one school district, the Houston Independent School District, and even though, as I mentioned earlier, it's the largest district in Texas, it only accounts for about 1/4 of the student population in the Houston area. There are a lot of other school districts in Houston and in the Houston area. And one of the things that we keep coming up against is there are a lot of research issues that are regional. They're not, you know, we can't address them just through a single school district. So a prominent example there is like, you know, school segregation. I just said that HISD is 8% white. So even if we were to magically redistribute the student population to make it more evenly distributed across that school district, we're not going to change the school composition very much because it's only 8% white. What we are seeing is that there's a lot more segregation between school districts than within school districts. In fact, this, oh, it's such a tiny, you probably can't see, sorry, it looked great on my computer. These are too tiny, but I'll tell you. So this is a map of Harris County, where Houston, the county in which Houston is. And these are all the school districts in Harris County. And what we find is that the school districts in the center of the county are, in those districts, white students are underrepresented. Like, you can't see, but these are in the single digits in terms of percentages, right? There's A-Leaf ISD that's 4% white. I said Houston ISD is 8% white. Aldine ISD is 2% white. Right? These are not tiny school districts, and they're in the single digits in terms of the percentage of white students. So, and that's an underrepresentation of the white student age population in the county, whereas the school districts in the periphery of the district, their white students are overrepresented, right? So we have these very clear patterns, and we keep finding, as you all know, there's a lot of research out there that shows that when you have really high concentrations of poor minority students in certain schools, it's very challenging. It's very challenging to run those schools. There are programs and interventions that you find that are really effective in one context, but then you try to apply them in these kinds of contexts, they often don't work. It's a very challenging context. So we need to figure out, you know, we need to do something about the underlying causes, right? All these things don't work. Well, we have these really high concentrations of poor minority students, right? What can we do about that? And so in order to study this and to do something, it's a regional issue. It's not a school district issue. So I'm super excited to report that as of just last week, a grant agreement was signed. It was this new U.S. grant. It hasn't been announced yet, so you all get to hear it first. From the Kinder Foundation, that will allow HERC to expand to 9 other school districts that share a border with HISD, so that we can meet regularly with the superintendents and other school district leaders as a region and develop a regional research agenda. This is very different from a school district. That's also important. We're going to continue to work specifically with HISD, but we want to also develop a regional research agenda. And there are lots of other topics like teacher recruitment and retention, or administrator recruitment and retention. That's a regional job market. It's not, you know, a school district specific kind of thing. Here's another example. Actually, you know what? Sure, actually, I'll go ahead. I was going to skip it, but I'll mention it real quick. So TEA, the Texas Education Agency, has developed several measures. Well, now they're called domains, and these are used for accountability purposes. So every school and school district in the state is held accountable according to these measures. One of those measures, domain 3, is labeled, and I'm quoting, closing performance gaps. We're very interested in inequalities and inequities, and so we're paying very close attention to that particular measure. It's called closing performance gaps. If I were to ask Yasmin, how would you measure, this is not a trick question, I promise, how would you measure gaps between, say, white and black students? And how would you measure whether those gaps are closing?
Within a year or over time?
Yeah, over time. Or first within a year, and then over time.
And we are thinking about regional, right? Because they are clustered. I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
No, let's just say just within one school district.
One school district.
In HISD, and I would ask you, like, I just want you to monitor whether HISD is closing gaps over time. How would you measure it?
Measure at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year and see if it's changing.
Yeah, but what would you measure exactly? If I'm saying I'm interested in the gaps between white students and black students.
For me, because I'm a math teacher educator.
That's why I asked you.
I focus on math, but
yes.
But yeah, or other predictors of the later achievement. So if the reading ability is highly correlated with their later achievement in life, I measure that one too.
No, I was asking a much simpler question than that. Like, how do you measure gaps?
Test
Yes,
scores.
and what do you do? No, but what do you do with those test scores?
Average for blacks, average for whites.
Yeah, look at the
Yes.
averages.
You
Yeah.
take the differences, you take the difference, that's what I'm telling you, I said, I promise you it's not a trick question. It's a very basic question. You take the difference between, say, the average test scores for black students and the average test scores for white students. You take the difference and then you take it and get measured again at time 2, and you see, is it got bigger or smaller? Right. I think that's how most of us, I mean, my undergrads at Rice would know how to do that. That is not how the state of Texas measures gaps. That's a good question. So it turns out they just measure, they have like a target within each group, and they just measure whether or not they reach that target, but never at any point do they actually measure gaps between groups, even though they call it that. But they don't actually take a difference. Like, this is the basic math. Like, they don't do that. Now there are reasons for that, but they call it. That's why I was very careful to say the label is closing performance gaps. And so that's how I interpreted it. That's how many people interpret it. That's not what they do. This is what we found, by the way. So there are some school districts for whom the populations are too small for certain groups, so they can't measure the gaps in those cases. But for those that they can, so there are 612 school districts in Texas where they can measure the gaps between white students and black students. And according to TEA, 601 of them met TEA standards for closing gaps. So according to TEA, 601 school districts are doing a good job of closing gaps between blacks and whites. And it turns out according to them, only 11 of them aren't doing that. According to our analysis, if we measure it like just the the difference, we found that of the 601 that, according to TEA, are closing gaps, only 310 are actually closing gaps. And 291 are not closing gaps. And among the 11 that TEA says are not closing gaps, we found that 4 of them actually are closing gaps. So how are we as a state going to, in terms of Texas, and by the way, other states do this too, check California, because I don't think California is doing a great job either of measuring these things. How are we to do anything about inequities if we're not even documenting them? We're not even measuring them. Or worse, we're actually pretending we're measuring them, but we're not actually measuring them, much less doing something about them. This is why I think these partnerships are so important. And the state of Texas, and I heard, in fact, just yesterday I was in San Francisco at the Carnegie Foundation Summit, and I sat next to, what is his name? A guy named Rick Miller, so he does like for the state of California.
Core.
Yeah, Core, thank you. I sat next to him on a panel and he was telling me that they have very, very limited research capacity. The state of California has limited research capacity, which is why they're partnering with research institutions, right, to do this kind of work. What I'm saying is, here's an example, right, like why we need researchers to be directly involved in this kind of work. There's so much need and so much potential, right, if we're like directly involved in doing this kind of work. By the way, this is for Hispanic white gaps. So there are 890 districts in the state for which they can measure Hispanic white gaps. According to TEA, 863 of them are closing gaps. According to our measure, only 443 of those are actually closing gaps. Yes?
So what do you do with this information now? Like, you know that TA is not doing a good job at this. You know that the state is not measuring this in the right way. Now is it just like pulling up the state, or like how, like, I guess what I'm asking is like a question about like creating change in this way.
Yes.
And, like, now
yes.
You've done a great job of like talking about like the Houston.
Right, because this is newer for me. I'm telling you, like, what we're just now, like this summer, working on with this expansion. What we are planning to do, and I have actually met with one of the deputy commissioners for the state, and mentioned this problem. The problem is that person left that position very soon. This is the challenge, right, of doing this kind of. She left that position pretty soon after we had this meeting, so now I have to start all over again. So I'm going to work. We're actually updating these analyses because this is based on 2015 data. We're now updating it for the most recent academic year, and we're using HISD data specifically to get into some other complications. The state of Texas came up with an A through F system. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. We found out that there are some schools for which it is mathematically impossible for them to get an A, for example, right? And we want to bring that information to the state. Yes?
So, states don't exist in a bubble, right? And particularly the federal policy around accountability perhaps dictates this process and also hinders this process by having all sorts of repercussions tied to authenticity of results.
Yes.
So how do you navigate that?
Right. You know, we were just talking about that yesterday in San Francisco because of ESSA. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, it's actually putting a lot more authority on states and local education agencies for decision making. This is another reason why I think this kind of partnership work is even more important now than ever, because the federal government is actually giving back a lot of that authority and decision making to the states and local agencies, which are school districts. But what they're saying in ESSA, as you probably know, it's like it's based on evidence-based decision making. But the fact of the matter is, most LEAs and the SEAs don't have very much research capacity. Some of them have none, right? Yet they're supposed to make evidence-based decisions. We have to do something about this. Like this, that's what I'm saying. I can't tell you how important it is to do research in partnership. They need it. We need it. I started off at the beginning. I need this, right? Because otherwise, I don't know why I'm doing this. And they need this. Like we just, we can do this right, like focusing on this, but the whole step of the way, like not as an afterthought, right? But working closely with the potential users of the research every step of the way. I mean, there's just so much. You're right. They're not in a bubble, and neither are we, right, as researchers. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. I feel like we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go in terms of really nailing this process down. Any comments or questions? I would love to hear from you all, especially in light of what you all are trying to do here in California. Yes?
So how does the information that you put out there, does the research you put out there filter through the rest of Houston, through those districts that you don't have a direct partnership with, and throughout Texas?
So we put out research briefs that I mentioned earlier go first to the school district, and then after they've had a chance to respond, then we publicize them more broadly. So they go on our HERC website. We're also housed in the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, and they put out press releases and blog posts about all the different projects. And that is how it gets out to the broader community. And I have been contacted. This is how the idea for the regional expansion arose in the first place. It was actually several years ago. Several superintendents from surrounding districts contacted me and said, we want to be a part of HERC. But at the time, I didn't have the funding to include them. And now I do. So now I'm like, yay, we can hire more people. We're essentially doubling the size of our research team for the purposes of expanding to the other districts. But that's how the information gets out there. And sometimes they'll do like radio interviews, or the Houston Chronicle will cover our work as well. Yes?
So a lot of this talk has focused on thinking about problems of inequality and access, which is my wheelhouse too, so I'm totally with you. But I'm just, this idea about thinking about having the district leaders and district partners contribute to the identification of the problems and the research ideas at the beginning, I think is really appealing. So I was just wondering if in your experience you came across any either problems they identified where you were like, oh, I either haven't thought about that or I really don't care about that, or if you sort of agreed on the problem, but then in thinking about maybe what you wanted to assess or research, there was also a disconnect. So I just would be interested in hearing any thoughts you had about that.
Yes, that's a great question. It's actually, it's a much more complicated process than it sounds like. Oh, we just get together, we jointly develop a research agenda, and we all agree. Right, it's not that easy. So sometimes they come up with topics, and what we do is we try to turn them into testable questions, testable research questions. And sometimes the things that they say aren't really testable, or so we have to like transform them and say, are we on the same page here? And other times, I'll say, like our research team suggests research questions based on the research literature, based on the expertise that I happen to have on my research team. Like when I hired a postdoc that specialized in early childhood education, I alerted them and said, I have a specialist in early childhood education. Do you have any? And that's when they were like, oh yes, pre-K. We want a pre-K evaluation. And so it comes from all sides. Sometimes it actually comes from the school board. I once had a board member say, we are making decisions about school closures, and we're doing it blindly. We have no idea how these school closures really affect the students. And we're like, hey, we have longitudinal data. Because I should preface this, we have a data sharing agreement with the school district, and we used that it took us a year to create a longitudinal database. So we had to merge literally hundreds of data sets, first within each academic year, and then link them across academic years, and then resolve all the discrepancies and recode things, because coding schemes change from year to year. It was a mess. But we now have a longitudinal database going back to 2006. So we can follow individual students over time, anyone that has spent any amount of time in the school district. We can follow individual teachers over time. We can link them as well. So like a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into the creation of this database. And by the way, it's accessible to external researchers as long as your project is approved by the school district, because they own the data, but the data are housed at Rice. So yeah, if you want to use it, please. We want to milk it for all it's worth. But what I wanted to say about that is that, to answer your question about this process, right, of creating the research agenda, that, as this school board member said, we don't know what we're doing in terms of the school closures. We said, hey, now we have this longitudinal database. We can actually follow students, their trajectories up to experiencing a school closure and afterwards, right? And we can do this for, as many students as you want. And so it was really helpful. So sometimes it comes from sometimes it'll come from the funders, actually. There's one, the Houston Endowment said, we're very interested in putting together sort of like this long-term educational pipeline, because now we have data from pre-K through high school graduation. We've of course linked it to National Student Clearinghouse data. We've also linked it most recently to Texas Workforce Commission data. So we can go up through workforce entry, and Houston Endowment says we want to see the whole picture, like from pre-K to workforce entry. What does that pipeline look like? Where are the biggest leaks in the pipeline, and where are they going? Are they ending up in jail? Are they ending, what's happening? So those kinds of questions, this is great that because we've built up this database that hopefully we can answer these questions a little bit faster than like starting from scratch every time, because that's another advantage of being in this long-term partnership as opposed to the project-based kind of collaboration. Yeah.
So thanks for your presentation. The work you're doing is really impressive. It's very exciting as a student who dreams about doing research on policy.
It's very exciting for me too.
I know, and your excitement is very infectious. It's fun to hear about it. So I've been hearing a lot about how you've developed all of these partnerships and how you're kind of bringing this research perspective to districts that are implementing policies and want feedback on their work. And so I'm seeing this direction from kind of research to policy, but I know that at the beginning of your talk, the whole reason for kind of creating this institution is also to be reflective on your own practice as a researcher and to make sure that you're doing research that's meaningful and also kind of changing the research community to make sure that we're all doing research that's meaningful for policy. So I'm just kind of wondering if you've had experiences where it's in addition to helping a district understand the impact of school closures on student outcomes and kind of informing the policy, have you had opportunities to reflect from your work with these districts to think more broadly about, hey, maybe we, as a research community, we need to be doing more research on X, Y, or Z and trying to share that with researchers at large? For example, when you were talking about the gifted funding versus the minority funding issue, and your solution was we need to change the funding formula, and then the district was well, we can't do that because these funding formulas and our dependency on enrollment and X, Y, Z makes it impossible. I was just wondering, did you reflect from that moment and think oh, well then maybe there's another lever that we need to be changing and we need to be studying more about X, Y, Z to really affect this issue, and we should be did it cause you to reflect at all about what you're studying and how we should be studying these issues better?
Absolutely. I would say that it definitely changes the way I think about what it is that we should be studying as researchers. But honestly, the main feedback that the main thing that I've been learning is that the academy, the broader academy, needs to change.
Okay.
It's not really about what we're studying, it's about how we're studying. That to me is the most pressing issue. I think that the academy, our publication process is horribly outdated.
Okay.
I think that needs to change. I think that the way that we review assistant professors for tenure purposes is outdated. I think that needs to change. And the things that I'm talking about, I know a lot of people, I get a lot of pushback about these issues, but I'm just giving you my opinion based on what I've learned here.
And so can you clarify, is it because doing this kind of research with districts, it's informative for policy, but it's not valued for tenure?
Exactly.
Is that okay?
Exactly.
Okay.
There are very few incentives in general. Now it varies from institution to institution. But in general, there are very few incentives for academics to take on this kind of work. Everything that I've described to you is extraordinarily time-consuming, and it's not in my job description.
Okay.
So I agree wholeheartedly with that point, and we're going to end on that because we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.